The morning I found the bright orange notice taped to my snow-covered mailbox, I knew my life in Pinewood Springs, Colorado was about to become a bureaucratic nightmare. My name is Zachary Xenakis, and I had moved into the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision just 6 months earlier. The house was perfect for me. A modest 3-bedroom ranch with a decent yard and mountain views that made my morning coffee taste better. What I didn't realize when I signed the papers was that the HOA president, a woman named Patricia, would become my personal tormentor over the most ridiculous things imaginable. The notice was dated 3 days prior, demanding I clear the snow from around my mailbox immediately or face a $500 fine. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd just been hit by one of the worst winter storms in Colorado history. 2 feet of snow had fallen in less than 48 hours, and the entire town was still digging out. My driveway was barely passable. My sidewalks were a work in progress, and Patricia was concerned about my mailbox. I pulled the notice off, the tape peeling away some of the paint underneath. The paper was crisp and clean, not a single snowflake marring its surface. I looked at the date again, 3 days ago, during the height of the storm when visibility was near zero and the governor had declared a state of emergency urging everyone to stay indoors. "This is insane," I muttered, trudging back through the knee-deep snow to my front door. Inside, I peeled off my winter gear and read the notice more carefully. It cited Section 14.7 of the HOA bylaws, which stated that all mailboxes must remain clearly visible and accessible at all times. The fine would be assessed in 3 business days if the violation wasn't corrected. I pulled out my phone and snapped several photos of the notice, something telling me I'd need evidence later. My neighbor, Tony, knocked on my door an hour later. He was in his 60s, retired from the Postal Service himself, and had warned me about Patricia when I first moved in. "Let me guess," he said, stamping snow off his boots. "Mailbox. How'd you know? Got the same notice. So did the Hendersons across the street. Patricia's been on a rampage." He handed me his own orange notice. "Here's the thing, though. Look at the date." I compared them. Same date, same time, stamp, different addresses. "She supposedly delivered these during the storm," Tony said. "But I was home all day, never heard a knock, never saw her car, nothing. And even if she did deliver it, there's no way she could have seen my mailbox. It was completely buried." That's when it clicked. "The postal worker," I said. "Did you get any mail that day?" "Actually, yeah. Linda came through. She's tougher than nails, that woman. Came in her personal truck with snow tires and delivered everything by hand." I grabbed my jacket. "I need to talk to her." The Pinewood Springs post office was a small building downtown, still surrounded by massive snow piles from the plows. Inside, I found Linda sorting packages, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked up when I walked in. "Let me guess," she said. "Patricia's mailbox finds. Word travels fast. I've already had 4 people come in today asking about it." Linda set down a package and walked over to the counter. "Here's what I can tell you. I delivered mail to Meadowbrook Estates 3 days ago during the storm. It was absolutely brutal out there. I couldn't see half the mailboxes, had to guess based on house numbers." "Did you deliver any HOA notices?" "I delivered mail to every box on my route, yes, including what looked like HOA notices in those orange envelopes." My heart sank. "So she's right. We did get proper notice." Linda held up a finger. "I delivered mail to mailboxes." I didn't say the mailboxes were visible or that the notices were properly posted. Most of those boxes were completely buried. I had to dig out several of them just to open the door and stuff the mail inside. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" "Testify? This going to court?" I have a feeling it might. Linda wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to me. That's my personal cell. If you need me, call. I've been a postal worker for 30 years and I'm sick of HOA tyrants making my job harder. Patricia tried to fine me once for blocking her driveway while delivering a package. Ladies got issues. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. It was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center, a small building near the subdivision entrance that doubled as a rec room and meeting space. I arrived 15 minutes early, but Patricia was already there, setting up papers at the head of the table. She was exactly what you'd picture when someone said, HOA Karen. Mid-50s, blonde hair with aggressive highlights, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her lips were pursed in a permanent expression of disapproval. "Zachary," she said, not looking up from her papers, "I assume you're here about the fine." "I am. I'd like to discuss how you expect people to maintain their mailboxes during a state of emergency. The bylaws are clear. Weather is not an excuse for non-compliance. The governor literally told everyone to stay inside. Then you should have cleared it before the storm hit." I took a deep breath. "Patricia, the storm forecasts predicted 6 inches. We got 2 feet. Nobody could have prepared for that. I managed to maintain my property just fine." "You have a snow removal service, and you're welcome to hire one." She finally looked at me, her expression cold. "The fine stands. If you don't pay within 30 days, we'll place a lien on your property." Other homeowners started filing in. I recognized Tony, the Hendersons, and about 15 others. Everyone looked tired and frustrated. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. The first 30 minutes covered mundane topics like landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules. Then she reached the agenda item labeled Violation Enforcement. "We've had an unfortunate increase in property violations," Patricia began, "particularly regarding mailbox maintenance during the recent weather event." "Weather event?" Mrs. Henderson interrupted. "It was the worst storm in 20 years. Regardless, the bylaws don't have weather exceptions. I've issued 23 fines for mailbox violations." 23, Tony stood up. "Patricia, that's nearly 40% of the neighborhood. Then clearly we have a compliance problem." "We have a reality problem," I said, standing as well. "You issued fines for violations during a state of emergency. That's not just unreasonable, it might be illegal." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening legal action, Zachary?" "I'm saying your enforcement is arbitrary and capricious." The fines were properly noticed and delivered according to postal regulations. Through mailboxes you claimed were invisible. That got murmurs of agreement from around the room. Patricia's face reddened. "The postal worker delivered the notices. That makes them official." "Let me ask you something," I said, pulling out my phone. "Did you actually see my mailbox on the day you wrote this notice? Because I have photos from that day. Want to see them?" I held up my phone, showing pictures of my mailbox completely buried under snow. Only the very top of the post was visible. Anyone with reasonable judgment would see that mailbox was inaccessible, I continued. The postal worker had to dig it out to deliver mail, which means your fine was issued for a violation that was physically impossible to correct at the time. "The date on the notice proves proper delivery," Patricia insisted. "The date proves when you wrote it, not when we could reasonably comply." The room erupted in conversation. People were pulling out their phones, showing pictures of buried mailboxes, discussing the storm timeline. Patricia banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! This meeting will come to order." But the damage was done. People were angry and they were organizing. Tony suggested we all refuse to pay the fines and force the HOA to take us to court. Someone else proposed a recall election for the board. Patricia looked like she was about to explode. "Fine," she spat. "You want to fight this? We'll fight it. I'll see every single one of you in court if necessary. This meeting is adjourned." She gathered her papers and stormed out, leaving the rest of us in the community center. "Well," Tony said, "that went better than expected." We formed a plan that night. Tony knew a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Rachel Morrison, and she had a reputation for eating HOA boards for breakfast. We agreed to pool our resources and hire her collectively. I called Rachel the next morning. Her voice was sharp and professional. "So Patricia's at it again," she said when I explained the situation. "I've dealt with Meadowbrook Estates before. Your HOA has a history of overzealous enforcement. Is what she's doing legal? That's complicated." "Technically, if the bylaws say mailboxes must be visible and accessible, she can enforce that. However, there are reasonableness standards. You can't be found in violation for something beyond your control. The state of emergency declaration actually helps your case. What do we need to prove?" "Several things. First, that the violations were physically impossible to correct at the time. Second, that the HOA acted in bad faith by issuing fines during an emergency. Third, and this is the interesting part, that the notices themselves were improperly delivered. I have a postal worker who will testify the mailboxes were inaccessible." "Perfect. That undercuts their entire enforcement mechanism. If the mailboxes were too buried to be visible, then the HOA couldn't have properly observed the violations, and you couldn't have received proper notice." Rachel agreed to take our case. She charged a flat fee that we split 23 ways, making it surprisingly affordable. She immediately sent a letter to the HOA board demanding they rescind the fines and threatening legal action if they refused. Patricia's response came via certified mail 3 days later. Not only did she refuse to rescind the fines, she added a second round of fines for continued non-compliance and harassment of board members. My total fine was now $1,500. "She's doubling down," Rachel said when I showed her the letter. "That's actually good for us. It shows a pattern of unreasonable enforcement. We're going to file a complaint in county court." The legal process moved faster than I expected. Rachel filed our complaint, the HOA filed a response, and we were scheduled for a hearing within 6 weeks. During that time, Patricia continued her campaign of harassment. She issued fines for Christmas decorations being up too late. It was January 2nd. For trash cans being visible from the street for more than 4 hours on collection day, and for a dog barking in someone's backyard. The woman was on a power trip, and she was spiraling. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the Pinewood Springs County Courthouse. I took the day off work, as did most of the other homeowners involved in the case. We met Rachel in the lobby, and she walked us through what to expect. The judge will hear arguments from both sides, review evidence, and potentially hear witness testimony. I've subpoenaed Linda, the postal worker. Her testimony is going to be crucial. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly dingy appearance. Judge Raymond Martinez presided, a stern-looking man in his 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes. He'd reviewed our filings and didn't look happy. Patricia sat at the defendant's table with the HOA's attorney, a young guy named Brad something or other who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Brad stood when the judge called the case. "Your Honor, this case is simple. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA has clear bylaws regarding property maintenance. The plaintiffs violated those bylaws. They were properly noticed and given time to cure. They refused. The HOA has every right to assess fines. During a state of emergency, Judge Martinez asked. The bylaws don't have a weather exception, Your Honor. I'm aware. Miss Morrison, Rachel stood, and I could see why she had a reputation. She commanded the room immediately. Your Honor, this case is about an HOA president who abused her authority to target residents who couldn't possibly comply with unreasonable demands. The evidence will show that Mrs. Patricia Whitmore issued fines for violations she couldn't have observed during a state of emergency when correction was impossible, and then doubled down when challenged. This is textbook bad faith enforcement. That's a serious accusation, the judge said. I have serious evidence, Your Honor. I'd like to call our first witness, Linda Kowalski, postal worker for Pinewood Springs. Linda took the stand and was sworn in. She looked calm and professional in her postal service uniform. Miss Kowalski, you delivered mail to Meadowbrook Estates on January 15th, correct? Yes. Can you describe the conditions that day? It was the worst storm I've seen in my 30 years as a carrier. Visibility was near zero, snow was still falling heavily, and most streets hadn't been plowed. I used my personal truck because the postal vehicle couldn't handle it. Did you deliver mail to every address on your route? I did. It's my job. Can you describe the condition of the mailboxes? Most were buried. I could barely find them. I had to dig out several just to open the doors and insert the mail. Rachel pulled out a poster board with photos. Your Honor, these are photographs taken by various residents on January 15th, showing the condition of their mailboxes. The photos were damning. Every single mailbox was completely buried, with only the tops of the posts visible in some cases. Miss Kowalski, in your professional opinion, were these mailboxes visible and accessible on January 15th? Absolutely not. They were hazardous to access. I nearly fell twice trying to reach them. Yet you delivered HOA violation notices to these mailboxes. I delivered whatever mail was in the boxes, including what appeared to be HOA notices. Could someone standing at street level have observed these mailboxes well enough to cite them for violations? Not without digging through several feet of snow first. Brad tried to object, but Rachel cut him off. One more question, Miss Kowalski. The notices were dated January 15th. In your professional opinion, could Mrs. Whitmore have physically accessed these properties to observe violations and deliver notices that same day? Not safely or reasonably, no. The roads were impassable until late afternoon, and visibility was too poor to see property details. Thank you. No further questions. Brad stood for cross-examination, looking uncomfortable. Miss Kowalski, you did successfully deliver mail that day, correct? Yes. So it was possible to access the mailboxes, with significant effort and risk, yes. And you did deliver the HOA notices. I delivered whatever mail was in the boxes for each address. So the residents did receive proper notice. Linda paused. They received pieces of paper. Whether those constituted proper notice under the circumstances is not my judgment to make. Brad sat down, clearly unsatisfied with that answer. Rachel called me to the stand next. I was nervous, but she walked me through the timeline methodically. When I moved in, when the storm hit, when I found the notice, what I did to try to resolve the issue. Mr. Xenakis, did you want to violate the HOA bylaws? Of course not. I didn't even know my mailbox was considered in violation until I found the notice. Could you have corrected the violation on January 15th? No. The governor had declared a state of emergency. We were told to stay indoors except for emergencies. My mailbox being buried wasn't worth risking my life in a blizzard. When did you clear your mailbox? January 17th, as soon as the roads were safe and I could access it properly. Before the fine was officially assessed. Yes, The notice said I had 3 business days. I corrected it in 2. Yet you were still fined. Yes, and when I questioned it, Mrs. Whitmore doubled the fine. Brad's cross-examination focused on whether I'd read the bylaws before buying my house. I admitted I had, but argued that no reasonable person would interpret always accessible to mean during a natural disaster. Rachel then called Tony to the stand, then Mrs. Henderson, building a pattern of Patricia's behavior. Each testimony was similar. Unreasonable fines, impossible compliance standards, and aggressive escalation when challenged. Finally, Rachel called Patricia herself. Patricia took the stand like she was accepting an award, her chin held high. She was sworn in and folded her hands primly in her lap. Mrs. Whitmore, you issued 23 fines on January 15th, correct? Yes. Did you personally observe each violation? I drove through the neighborhood that morning, during the state of emergency. I have a 4-wheel drive vehicle. But you observed violations. You could see the mailboxes clearly enough to determine they violated bylaws. Patricia hesitated. I could see the general conditions. Mrs. Whitmore, yes or no? Could you see the mailboxes on January 15th? The snow was heavy, but I know my neighborhood. That's not an answer. Could you see Mr. Xenakis' mailbox specifically on January 15th? I knew it was in violation. How did you know if you couldn't see it? Everyone's mailbox was in violation. The whole neighborhood was buried. The courtroom went silent. Rachel let the words hang in the air. So you admit you couldn't see the mailboxes, yet you issued fines anyway. Patricia's face reddened. The bylaws are clear. It's not my fault people don't maintain their properties. During a natural disaster. Weather isn't an excuse. Your Honor, Rachel said, turning to Judge Martinez. Mrs. Whitmore has admitted she issued fines for violations she couldn't observe during a state of emergency when compliance was impossible. This is the definition of bad faith enforcement. Brad tried to salvage things during redirect, but Patricia was rattled. She insisted the bylaws gave her authority to enforce rules regardless of circumstances. She claimed homeowners should have prevented snow buildup before the storm. She even suggested people should have stayed home from work to continuously clear their mailboxes during the blizzard. Judge Martinez's expression grew darker with each answer. When testimony concluded, the judge took a brief recess to review evidence. We sat in the hallway, nervous energy crackling between us. How do you think it went? I asked Rachel. Patricia buried herself. No pun intended, but judges can be unpredictable with HOA cases. Some are very deferential to HOA authority. We filed back in 20 minutes later. Judge Martinez looked annoyed. I've reviewed the evidence and testimony, he began. This case represents everything wrong with HOA enforcement. Mrs. Whitmore, your behavior was not just unreasonable, it was reckless and vindictive. Patricia's mouth opened in protest, but the judge held up a hand. You issued fines for violations you admittedly couldn't observe. You did so during a declared state of emergency. You doubled the fines when challenged, not because the violations continued, but because the homeowners dared to question your authority. This is textbook bad faith. He turned to Rachel. Miss Morrison, your clients are entitled to relief. I'm ordering the HOA to rescind all fines related to the January 15th snow event. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to revise its bylaws to include reasonable accommodation for weather events and other circumstances beyond homeowner control. Your Honor, Brad said, standing. The HOA board would need to vote on bylaw changes. Then they'll vote, and if they refuse, I'll appoint a special master to oversee the HOA's operations until compliance is achieved. I'm also awarding attorneys' fees to the plaintiffs. Patricia shot to her feet. This is outrageous. I was enforcing the rules. You were abusing your authority. Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore. I will not be spoken to like this. Do you know how much work I put into this neighborhood? How many hours I spend maintaining property values? By harassing your neighbors. By enforcing standards that everyone agreed to. Judge Martinez's voice went cold. Mrs. Whitmore, one more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. This hearing is concluded. The HOA has 30 days to comply with my order. He banged his gavel and it was over. We spilled out into the courthouse hallway, everyone talking at once. Rachel was pleased but cautious. This is a good ruling, but implementation might be tricky. Patricia strikes me as someone who doesn't like losing. She was right to be cautious. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia launched a campaign of petty retaliation that would have been comical if it wasn't so exhausting. She issued fines for grass that was too long in February under the snow. She claimed several cars violated parking rules by being unsightly. They were normal sedans. She even tried to fine Tony for having a wreath on his door past Valentine's Day. Every fine was documented and sent to Rachel, who compiled them into a motion for further relief. But things escalated beyond civil court when Patricia made a critical mistake. It started when the Hendersons' adult son visited for a weekend. He parked his truck in their driveway, perfectly legal according to HOA rules. Patricia left a notice on the windshield saying the truck was commercial-looking and needed to be removed. The Hendersons ignored her. The next morning, the truck had a boot on it. Not an HOA warning boot, but an actual commercial vehicle immobilization device. The kind used by parking enforcement. Except Meadowbrook Estates was private property and Patricia had no authority to boot vehicles. Mr. Henderson called the police. Officer Martinez, no relation to the judge, arrived and took statements. He examined the boot and found it was purchased from an online retailer and installed by Patricia herself, according to security camera footage from the Hendersons' doorbell camera. "Madam," Officer Martinez said when he arrived at Patricia's house, "you can't just boot someone's vehicle. That's illegal restraint of property." "It's an HOA matter," Patricia said. "I'm enforcing parking regulations. On private property that isn't yours. The truck was in the Hendersons' own driveway. It was visible from the street. That doesn't give you authority to immobilize it. I'm going to need you to remove the boot immediately." Patricia refused. She claimed HOA bylaws gave her broad enforcement powers. Officer Martinez explained that HOA bylaws don't supersede criminal law. Patricia insisted she'd done nothing wrong. "Madam, if you don't remove the boot, I'm going to charge you with illegal restraint of property." "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." "That's not a legal shield, madam." Things went downhill from there. Patricia refused to cooperate, getting increasingly hostile. She demanded to speak to the police chief. She threatened to sue the city. She even claimed discrimination, though she couldn't articulate what she was being discriminated against for. Officer Martinez was patient, but eventually had to take action. He arrested Patricia for illegal restraint of property and obstruction when she physically tried to prevent him from removing the boot. The booking photo made local news. "HOA president arrested for booting resident's car" was the headline, complete with a picture of Patricia being led to a police cruiser, still insisting she'd done nothing wrong. The arrest seemed to break something in her. At the arraignment, she represented herself, against the advice of the public defender, and went on a 20-minute rant about how she was the only person keeping property values high, how residents were ungrateful, and how she was the victim of a conspiracy. The judge set bail and ordered her to stay away from Meadowbrook Estates, except to access her own property. She was forbidden from conducting HOA business pending resolution of the criminal case. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Patricia as president. Tony was appointed interim president. His first act was to rescind every fine Patricia had issued in the past 6 months and establish a review committee for all future enforcement actions. Patricia's criminal case moved forward. She was offered a plea deal: plead guilty to a misdemeanor, pay a fine, perform community service, and agree to resign from the HOA board permanently. She refused, insisting on a trial. The trial was quick. The doorbell camera footage clearly showed Patricia installing the boot. The Hendersons testified they never gave permission. Patricia's defense was that HOA bylaws authorized her actions. The jury didn't buy it. They convicted her in less than an hour. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge gave her 90 days in county jail, suspended to 30 days with good behavior, a $1,000 fine, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in Colorado. Mrs. Whitmore, the judge said, you've shown a complete disregard for the rights of your neighbors and the rule of law. Your position as HOA president was not a license to harass and control others. Perhaps time away will help you understand that. Patricia tried to appeal, but the conviction stood. Meanwhile, Rachel filed a civil lawsuit on behalf of all the homeowners for harassment, emotional distress, and the costs incurred fighting Patricia's fines. The HOA's insurance settled for a significant sum rather than go to trial, with the money distributed among the affected homeowners. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA underwent significant reforms. The bylaws were rewritten to include weather exceptions, establish an appeals process for fines, and limit the president's unilateral enforcement authority. A management company was hired to handle day-to-day operations, removing the personal vendetta element that had plagued Patricia's reign. I got a check for $3,500 from the settlement. It covered my legal fees and then some. More importantly, life in the neighborhood improved dramatically. Tony ran the HOA like a normal person, enforcing rules when necessary, but with common sense and compassion. Linda, the postal worker, became something of a local celebrity. Her testimony had been the turning point in our case, and people recognized her as she made her rounds. Someone started a petition to name a street after her, which didn't go anywhere, but was a nice gesture. 6 months after the initial mailbox incident, I was sitting on my porch on a warm summer evening when Tony walked over with 2 beers. "Thought you might want to celebrate," he said, handing me one. "Celebrate what?" "Patricia's officially moved out, sold her house and left town. Heard she's moving to Arizona." I took a long drink of beer. "Good riddance. You know, when you moved in, I told you the HOA was rough. I never imagined it would end up here. Me neither. I just wanted to clear my mailbox." "Well, you did more than that. You got rid of the neighborhood tyrant. People are actually enjoying living here now." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching kids play in the street and neighbors chat on their lawns. It felt like a real community for the first time since I'd moved in. "Hey," Tony said eventually, "we're voting on board positions next month. You should run for something. After all this." "No way. Come on, you'd be good at it. And you understand what not to do," I laughed. "That's a low bar. It's higher than you think." I considered it. The idea of joining the HOA board after everything that had happened seemed absurd. But maybe that was exactly why I should do it. Someone needed to make sure the reform stuck, that the next president didn't turn into another Patricia. "Maybe," I said. "Let me think about it." Tony clinked his beer bottle against mine. "That's all I ask." A week later, I got a letter in the mail. Not an orange violation notice, but a regular white envelope with the HOA logo. Inside was a thank you note from the board, signed by every member, expressing gratitude for standing up to Patricia's abuses and helping reform the organization. At the bottom, in Tony's handwriting, was a postscript. The nomination deadline is Friday. Just saying. I looked at my mailbox, clearly visible at the end of my driveway, no snow in sight. It had been the catalyst for everything, a ridiculous fine over something nobody could control. It had led to legal battles, arrests, reforms, and ultimately, a better neighborhood. The following Friday, I submitted my nomination for a board position. The election was held 3 weeks later at a community barbecue Tony organized. The whole neighborhood turned out. It felt less like an HOA meeting and more like a block party, which was exactly the point. When the votes were counted, I'd been elected to a board seat by a comfortable margin. Tony remained president, Mrs. Henderson took the secretary position, and we had a full board of people who actually cared about the community rather than power trips. My first act as a board member was proposing a common-sense amendment to the bylaws. Any fine over $100 had to be approved by a majority of the board. Any fine issued during a declared emergency was automatically void. Homeowners had the right to appeal any fine to the full board, not just the president. The amendments passed unanimously. During my second month on the board, we got a letter from Patricia's lawyer. She was suing for defamation and wrongful termination from the board. Rachel took one look at the complaint and laughed. She's filing pro se through a lawyer, which doesn't even make sense. The claims are nonsense. She was convicted in criminal court. There's no defamation in reporting facts. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. Patricia was ordered to pay our legal fees. She never paid and eventually declared bankruptcy. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she tried to join her new HOA board in Arizona and been rejected after they found news articles about her arrest. Life moved on. Seasons changed. Winter came again, and with it snow. This time, when a storm hit, the HOA sent out a notice reminding residents to clear their mailboxes when safe and practical to do so. No fines were threatened. No violations were issued. When the snow finally melted, everyone's mailboxes were fine. I ran into Linda one day while checking my mail. She pulled up in her Postal truck and waved. "How's the HOA business treating you?" she asked. "Boring, thankfully. We had a meeting last week about pool hours. That's as exciting as it gets. Boring is good. Boring means Patricia isn't around." Amen to that. She handed me a small stack of mail. Regular stuff. Bills, advertisements, a postcard from a friend. No orange envelopes. "You know," Linda said, "I've been delivering mail for 30 years and I've seen a lot of HOA drama. Yours was the first time I ever had to testify in court." "Sorry about that." "Don't be. It was the highlight of my year. Finally got to tell an HOA president she was full of it in an official capacity." We both laughed. "For what it's worth," I said, "you saved about 23 families a lot of money and stress." That testimony made all the difference. Just telling the truth. You folks did the hard part, standing up to her. As she drove away to finish her route, I looked at my mailbox again. It was such a mundane thing, just a metal box on a post. But it had become a symbol of something larger. The fight against petty tyranny, the importance of reasonable governance, and the power of community action. The next board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening. Tony had sent around an agenda. Approval of the landscaping budget, discussion of the fall festival, and review of new homeowner applications. Nothing controversial. Nothing that would require legal intervention or police involvement. Just normal, boring HOA business. And that was exactly how it should be. The community center was comfortably full when I arrived. Residents chatted amiably. Kids played in the corner with provided toys, and someone had brought cookies. It felt less like a governmental proceeding and more like a neighborhood gathering. Tony called the meeting to order with none of Patricia's theatrical gavel banging. We worked through the agenda efficiently, making decisions by consensus where possible and voting when necessary. The whole meeting took 45 minutes. Afterwards, people lingered to socialize. Mrs. Henderson showed me pictures of her grandkids. A newer resident asked questions about snow removal services. Someone organized an impromptu pizza order, and we turned the meeting into an informal dinner party. This was what an HOA should be, I realized. Not a vehicle for one person's control fantasies, but a tool for neighbors to work together, solve common problems, and build community. The rules existed to maintain property values and quality of life, not to punish people for circumstances beyond their control. As I drove home that night, I passed the subdivision entrance sign. Meadowbrook Estates, a community of friends. During Patricia's reign, it had felt like false advertising. Now, it actually seemed accurate. My house looked welcoming in the dusk, lights glowing warm in the windows. The mailbox stood at the end of the driveway, empty and unremarkable. No orange envelopes, no threats, no drama, just a mailbox. I smiled and pulled into my garage, grateful for boring normalcy. The next morning, I was sipping coffee on my porch when Tony walked over, newspaper in hand. "Have you seen this?" He handed me the local section. There was an article about HOA reform legislation being proposed in the Colorado state legislature. It included provisions for weather-related violation exceptions, mandatory appeals processes, and limits on fine amounts. At the bottom, the article mentioned our case as an example of HOA overreach. "We're famous," Tony said with a grin, "or infamous depending on who you ask. The bill's got good support, might actually pass." I read through the article again. Our fight with Patricia hadn't just fixed our neighborhood, it had sparked broader change. Other communities had experienced similar abuses, and our successful legal challenge had given them a roadmap. "You should testify," I said. "If they hold hearings, you'd be perfect." "Only if you come with me. You're the one who started all this." I just wanted to clear my mailbox, and ended up changing state law. Funny how that works. Over the following months, the legislation moved through committee hearings and floor votes. Tony and I both testified, along with Rachel and several other homeowners. Linda came too, providing the Postal Service perspective on HOA interference. The bill passed in late spring and was signed into law that summer. It wasn't perfect, but it established baseline protections for homeowners against the kind of abuses Patricia had perpetrated. HOAs could still enforce rules, but they had to do so reasonably, with clear appeals processes and limitations on when fines could be assessed. Other states started looking at similar legislation. I got calls from homeowners in Texas, Florida, and Nevada, all dealing with their own HOA nightmares. I shared our story, connected them with Rachel, and offered whatever support I could. A movement was growing, pushing back against HOA tyranny nationwide. None of it would have happened if I'd just paid Patricia's fine, if I'd accepted the injustice and moved on. But I couldn't. Something about that orange envelope, taped to my snow-covered mailbox during a blizzard, demanding the impossible and threatening my home over it, had triggered a stubborn refusal to submit. I was glad I'd fought. Not just for the money or the principle, but because it had connected me to my community in a way that might never have happened otherwise. I knew my neighbors now. We looked out for each other. We worked together to solve problems instead of competing over whose lawn was greener. That was worth more than any settlement check. 2 years after the initial mailbox incident, I was serving my second term on the HOA board. Tony had stepped down as president, and Mrs. Henderson had taken over. I'd moved up to vice president. The board was functioning smoothly, and the neighborhood was thriving. Property values were up, despite Patricia's predictions that relaxed enforcement would tank them. People wanted to live in a community that was reasonable and welcoming. It turned out. We had a waiting list of potential buyers whenever a house went on the market. I never heard from Patricia again. Her forwarding address eventually expired, and she faded into memory. Occasionally, newer residents would ask about the reforms and why we had such detailed weather exception policies. The story would get retold, usually growing more dramatic with each retelling, until Patricia became something of a cautionary tale. "Don't pull a Patricia" became neighborhood shorthand for overreacting to minor issues. One winter evening, I was clearing my driveway after a moderate snowfall when a car pulled up. A woman rolled down her window. "Excuse me, does this neighborhood have an HOA?" "It does. I'm on the board, actually." She looked nervous. "Are they strict?" "I'm interested in the house on Maple, but I've had bad experiences with HOAs before." I leaned on my shovel. "We enforce reasonable rules to maintain the neighborhood, but we're not going to fine you for having snow on your mailbox during a blizzard." Her eyebrows went up. "That's specific." "Long story. Here's my number. If you have questions about the HOA, feel free to call. I'm happy to explain how we operate." She bought the house. So did many others who appreciated that we'd built something different here, something better. A homeowner association that actually served homeowners instead of ruling over them. Years passed. I eventually rotated off the board, having served my time and helped establish practices that would outlast any individual member. The reforms held. The community stayed strong. And my mailbox, that unremarkable metal box on a post, stood clear and accessible, a silent reminder of where it all began. Sometimes, when winter storms rolled through, I'd stand at my window and watch the snow pile up around the mailbox. And I'd smile, remembering Patricia's ridiculous fine, Linda's crucial testimony, and Judge Martinez's sharp rebuke of HOA overreach. I'd remember that ordinary people, when pushed too far, could fight back against petty tyrants and win. I'd remember that communities worked best when they worked together, not when they worked under the thumb of someone on a power trip. And I'd remember that sometimes justice came down to a postal worker in a snowstorm, willing to tell the truth about buried mailboxes and impossible demands. The neighborhood was quiet now, peaceful in the way good neighborhoods should be. Kids grew up here, families thrived, and people looked forward to coming home. The HOA existed as it should, quietly managing shared resources and maintaining standards, but never dominating lives. My mailbox stood at the end of my driveway, covered in snow, and I didn't worry about it. When the storm passed and the roads were safe, I'd clear it. Until then, it could wait, because that's what reasonable people did, and we were a neighborhood of reasonable people now, finally.